respect to the elders, past and present.
Sorry.
That's all right. Sorry, Chris is recording. Yes, so I just want to pay my respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And as I say, I'm in Melbourne, so I'm on Wurundjeri land here. Okay, so we have 3 guest speakers tonight. We're going to be talking about monitoring and evaluation. I'm pretty sure we all understand what monitoring and evaluation is and how important it is in project work, in programming, in the international development sector, where we need to follow the progress of all of our projects and our programs, and then obviously evaluate them for the evidence base that we need to progress and to validate the projects, but also to, I guess, bluntly please funders, and quite a few other aspects from that point of view. I don't want to hold us up too much with a lot of chatter about it in terms of what we're doing. So our guests tonight are 3 women working in the sector, fairly closely in the sector, who do work in monitoring and evaluation as well as in other areas. And we have Ellie, Catherine and Claire joining us tonight. So as I said, in talking about monitoring and evaluation, we'll start possibly with Ellie. Sorry, just getting beeps going at me. We'll start with Ellie. So Ellie is a gender data consultant for UN Women in Timor-Leste, and works as a manager for researching and M&E with what is now known as Tetra Tech International, but most of you would probably know it as formerly being Coffee International. The new name is Tetra Tech International, but formerly Coffee International Development. Ellie's worked in public policy as well as monitoring and evaluation across not-for-profits as well as government and international development sectors for up to 10 years, for close to 10 years. Ellie, maybe you'd like to explain a bit more. I'll give it to you to take away here and let us know who you are, what your role is, and how you came to be in monitoring and evaluation, and a bit about the work you do at M&E in the sector.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks everyone for your time this evening. So I suppose currently I'll just give a brief overview of the 2 roles I'm working in. The first one, so I was previously, a bit of context, I was previously working in Timor-Leste before the pandemic hit back in 2019, which is why I am working for UN Women as a gender data consultant just 1 day a week. But that's sort of primarily to stay in contact with that work I was doing. So I'm doing it currently remotely, but it's for the Spotlight Initiative, which is a global initiative that aims to end violence against women. And I'm working directly with the Secretary of State for Equality and Inclusion, which is the women's machinery in government in Timor-Leste. And we're working to assess how effectively over the past 5 years, ministries and community service organisations have monitored the National Action Plan on gender-based violence. So what data they have collected, whether they've been implementing certain activities in the National Action Plan, and also what resources in terms of funding they've allocated to the National Action Plan on gender-based violence. So we're collecting that information to inform the new National Action Plan, which is being developed starting next year, but also to inform what sort of capacity development needs and training we could provide through the Spotlight Initiative ministries might want. So we're in the process of doing interviews at the moment. And then more full-time, I work in Tetra Tech International Development, as Jill mentioned, and that's it's actually based in Adelaide, the head office, but there's a Melbourne office as well. And that is, I suppose, Tetra Tech is a management consultancy, and I'm quite new to the private sector. My background is more in not-for-profit and government. So I'm still learning very much about how the process works, but it's sort of a combination of the technical work, so delivering monitoring and evaluation work for clients such as DFAT, as well as, say, ASEAN or other sort of multilateral organizations working across the Asia Pacific. But then there's also a lot of project management and administrative business development involved, which is sort of winning the work, which is new to me, but is keeps me busy. So yeah, that's sort of where I am now. But I definitely didn't have a linear pathway to monitoring and evaluation. I sort of studied a Bachelor of Arts Political Science and was always interested in traveling and learning new languages. So I also studied Spanish, and then went on to study a Masters of International Relations, focusing on public policy. And I think that's where my interest for evaluation came about, just looking at the importance of how public policy needs to be evidence-based and informed by community perspectives. So I did a bit of travel through my master's and was lucky enough to also volunteer and intern at a range of different not-for-profit organizations through while I was studying. So when I was reflecting on my early career, I very much, which was about 10 years ago, I was working in small NGOs, some domestically, the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, conducting research, but then working at Amnesty International and Oxfam, which is where I sort of saw monitoring and evaluation applied for the first time in a real organization rather than just on paper at university. And that's where I sort of saw the link between how important it was to understand data and to critically think about what we're investing in and what sort of programs are we supporting, whether it's through international development or through government. And then, so that was sort of, I learned a lot about, yeah, the not-for-profit sector and how that works really well with community. And then I actually moved into the university sector because I was really interested in research. And so I was working in the Vice Chancellor's office in kind of a research area looking at domestic policy and how the university could sort of operate as not so much a think tank, but a research institute that could really inform the public of the importance of evidence-based policy and keep government accountable. And so through that, I was working on a public policy book that was being published, and one of the chapters was evaluation. So evaluation sort of kept coming up in all these different workplaces that I was participating in, and I thought, wow, like I'm really interested in getting into the international development sector, and it's a hard, I think it's a very competitive, challenging sector to get into. So I was still sort of navigating my way, but saw the importance of evaluation and me probably having that gap in my skills and wanting to sort of find a pathway to learn more about evaluation. And so one of the opportunities, I suppose, that probably made a difference was a role came up in the Victorian government, in the Department of Health and Human Services. And it was a new evaluation unit, research and evaluation unit, to look at policies and programs within health and human services in a model that was sort of trying to move away from the private sector model of commissioning out and spending a lot of money on reports, to building the capacity of the Department of Health and Human Services program staff and policy staff to think about evidence while they were designing programs or while they were writing briefs to ministers around policy recommendations. So that was a really amazing opportunity to get. And I think I was able to get it through my research experience and probably again through my studies, but that built my sort of a real sort of foundational knowledge of what is needed in terms of different qualitative and quantitative methods for different evaluations. I worked with a lot of really experienced people from a range of different sectors, from academia to health to social services and child protection, family violence. So I was surrounded by a team that I really learned a lot from, and probably developed a really strong understanding of the different phases of evaluation and how it could work potentially, or how I could bring those skills to the international development sector. So I was there for about 3 years in government, and then I moved into, I moved to Timor-Leste, but I did it through the Australian Volunteers Program, which I think is another opportunity, I think, that probably helped me on my career path, because it's not currently operating it's operating remotely. You can do remote volunteering, but it's an incredible way to have a supported opportunity to go to a different country and to learn a language, to really learn about cross-cultural communication and build relationships. But it's set up in a way that I think I really agree with in terms of development, because it doesn't, I suppose you're not taking a position of a local person. You're sitting alongside and working alongside and learning probably more. I think I learned more from them than they learned from me. But it's sort of that sharing of knowledge and skills. And so I was in Dili working in the government, again, working in the Secretary of State for Equality and Inclusion, within the, as a monitoring and evaluation mentor. So that really opened up opportunities for me to explore. Okay, so I suppose I learned for 3 years what monitoring and evaluation was like domestically, and then I connected with a whole lot of different people working in Dili, which is quite a small city, to learn about what happens in monitoring and evaluation internationally. And it was quite different, and it was a big learning curve, but I think it was an amazing way to grow professionally and to sort of a safe way to trial and error things with your colleagues, and to really see how data collection can be done in maybe an environment where the technology isn't as fast or available, the resources aren't necessarily there. Definitely the data wasn't there often, because that was the last thing that was resourced or thought about. Yeah, and so I think through that opportunity, I met a lot of different people in international development, and say working in community service organisations, working at the real sort of grassroots level, to people working in DFAT and different organisations, people working in the UN or international NGOs. And I think a lot of people do say this, but it is very true. The more people that you meet or have opportunities to engage with, I think it's a great learning opportunity, but it also opens up opportunities for work collaborations and partnerships. And so that was one thing that I realized when I was there. And so we actually developed a partnership with a range of different government organizations to improve and centralize data being collected on a whole range of gender policies. And that sort of led me to the work that I'm doing today, even though it's currently remotely. It's led to that opportunity of being able to continue to work with the organization I was working with through AVI, but through a new program to end violence against women. So I would definitely recommend, once the AVI program comes up again, or even now, you can engage remotely, which is a great learning experience as well, I've heard. So yeah, that's sort of me in a nutshell. And then, I don't know, Jill, did you want me to go over certain challenges and what's involved day to day for my M&E work?
We might, I'm just looking at the timing now, and I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you. We might visit that maybe in general conversation afterwards, and that, sure, because I think it would be interesting, but I'm quite keen to find out on a couple of points. and I'll start with the latter one first, is when you said you went to Timor-Leste and you were then invested on the ground, obviously, as a volunteer with AVI, you were then having to both capacity build, help implement, but also teach M&E and capacity build with the staff on the ground. Given what you'd done, what you described you'd done in all the lead up to going to Timor-Leste, how hard or how different was it? How different did you find the practicality of applying M&E and actually teaching it to the locals and how it works, to the theory of it or the designing of it when you worked in terms of more program design or evaluation design and things like that? I mean, is it really, how different did you find it actually on the ground trying to teach the locals what M&E was and how it's meant to work? Because data collection, I think for all of us who have done this, data collection on the ground within communities in other countries is not as straightforward as it seems on paper.
Yes, that's true. I think the key thing I found was when I was working in government, it was very high tech. We had so many different methodologies and a lot of them were coming from academia, which was great. So there was a lot of theory in what I was doing when I was in DHHS, as well as high level quantitative methods. And then when I got to Timor, I suppose it's different. Each country is different, but also so government would be very different in Timor to the civil society organizations, which report a lot more to donors, so they're more used to the monitoring and they've probably got higher data literacy, but within government, it's quite low. So I found that when I was working with them, we were doing the very, very basics, like the nuts and bolts of developing a program logic, developing indicators, surveys, just sort of looking as well at whether the activities that they were implementing aligned with their national action plans and national strategies. So things like that. And there really wasn't any data, or what data was collected was probably more through oral communication, which was really interesting as well, sort of learning about that. I guess that's a bit of a difference between that oral versus written culture. And I think a lot of foreigners find that challenging going into Timor, but sort of I had to adapt a lot and change a lot of my preconceptions.
Did you find it hard to actually have them have a structure around M&E? Like you say, if you just, a lot of it would be oral, a lot of it's anecdotal in terms of keeping records and actually having written data evidence the way we like to have it, whether it's stories of change or whether it's, getting a whole lot of quantitative as well as the qualitative stuff. Was it hard to actually keep them to a structure? Like the paperwork and the questioning, depending on which methodology you're using, was it hard?
Yeah, I think yes. That I think in terms of using tables and reporting against tables, that was fine. We didn't use Excel. Some ministries did use Excel, but I think my boss in government in Timor preferred not to, because he thought it would probably be too complicated. So that was, it was very much tables in Word. I think they see things differently, and very much the value to them was going to communities and doing interviews, and that was their monitoring, and they would do it, and they would respond to questions on paper. So they would have a written form, but it was it's not as valued, I think, the report writing and that kind of thing.
Very hard to get it very efficiently done and everything.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to quickly touch on before we move on to Catherine, I just wanted to quickly touch on where you said from your, in terms of the change in the work you were doing, how you went from the public sector to the private sector. So you're now obviously with Tetra Tech. The difference, I mean, you said you haven't been with Tetra Tech for long, but there would obviously be a big difference between going from the public sector and public service area to the private sector and working for a managing contractor. How have you found that in terms of the sort of work you're doing? Is it more freeing? Have you got more flexibility, or how does that compare?
I think in the private sector, I do more project management and more sort of client engagement, business development, and maybe only say 30% M&E technical work, or maybe a bit more. Yeah, I suppose it depends. It depends on the project, but that's been my experience so far, and that's probably reflective of me finding the systems very challenging to learn, all the monitoring budget systems. So maybe that's why. But in government, you probably have more focus on the projects that say, more focus on the M&E. Someone else does that. Like we've got teams to do procurement, teams to do IT. Yeah. So it's it's a bit different. But in terms of learning, I'm learning a whole lot of new skills or things that I haven't ever done before.
Okay, all right, well, that's really good. All right, thank you very much for that, Ellie. That was really interesting. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Jill.
Catherine, we're going to move on to Dr. Catherine Ginn. So as I said, Catherine's the currently, I think you said you're working for DFAT still, the Director of Consulting, also Director of Consulting with Lotus Evaluation, but contracted as an MEL specialist to DFAT and still working with DFAT, especially in the area of health security for the Indo-Pacific region. Catherine, is that right?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
Do you want to carry away with head off with that and tell us a bit more about that, because that sounds really interesting.
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Just before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and that's the land from which I am coming, and also to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Before I just move into DFAT, which I was going to do in a second, I just wanted to paint a picture of an evaluation that I was on a couple of years ago, just as one extreme, and then I'll go to DFAT as the other extreme. So this was one that I was doing for Fred Hollows Foundation, and it was evaluating 13 years of their eye health work in Vietnam, which was their longest standing work. It was part of a longer evaluation, so it wasn't just a one-off fly-in, fly-out, but this particular one was I think it was over 8 days. We had 10 plane flights. We went to 6 provinces across Vietnam. We worked with 3 teams, 1 team in the north, 1 team in the centre, 1 team in the south. I'd never met any of them before. I had to travel with someone that whole time that I'd never worked with before. We got on famously, thank goodness, and now we're really good friends. And we interviewed 70 people and then had to synthesize all the findings at the end and do a series of workshops and get engagement amongst the staff that we weren't traveling with at the end. So I guess that's just to give you a flavour of the type of evaluation work you can do, but obviously it varies enormously. And I tend to not like the fly in, fly out, but as I said, that was part of a larger evaluation. To move on to Jill's point about, so now right now I'm working as an MEL advisor, monitoring, evaluation and learning advisor for the Centre for Health Security, which is a centre which is part of DFAT that's doing a lot of work around health system strengthening, but also the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine and everything that goes with that. So there are 3 main investments that we're working on. One is the Health Security Initiative, which is across the Indo-Pacific, everything to do with health systems strengthening. Mainly to do with health security and also pandemic preparedness and response. The second one is the Vaccine Access and Health Security Initiative, and that's the one that's really taking up a lot of time and effort at the moment, as you can imagine. So it's everything from rolling out vaccines or supplying vaccines to 18 countries in the Asia Pacific, but also all the end-to-end stuff that you need to be able to distribute those. So everything from cold chain strengthening, laboratory support, surveillance systems, public health awareness campaigns. In different countries, we're doing different things and we're working with lots of different partners. And that's, you can imagine it's a pretty dynamic space that we're working in at the moment. And finally, as part of the centre, we've also just recently started the Quad work, so the Quad Vaccine Partnership. You might have heard about it in the news in the last couple of weeks. So that's an initiative with the US government, Japan, India and Australia, also to roll out vaccines and also vaccine support across the Asia Pacific. So just to give you a sense of scale, it's over $1 billion worth of programming across those 3 things, 18 countries, multiple years, and 60, 70 partners like government, universities, research institutes, NGOs, multilaterals, you name it, they're in there. So it's a really exciting space to be working in, and it's a very dynamic space. And excuse me if I look left occasionally, I've just got some notes down here. So in terms of my role, I'm part of a small MEL team at the centre, and we do a bit of everything. A lot of the things that Ellie talked about, we do. So everything from designing sort of performance assessment frameworks or frameworks of measures to measure performance, and also to capture learnings across those big investments that I talked about. We also might work on smaller monitoring, evaluation and learning frameworks for either specific countries or specific partners, and designing those or supporting partners to design their own. Like Ellie mentioned, I do quite a lot of workshops, so capacity strengthening around MEL, because a lot of people at the centre and a lot of the partners have varying capacity and experience around MEL. And also then just evaluations of specific programs. There's lots of specific programs within the centre, and we might do specific evaluations around those or around the investment as a whole. So in terms of, I was just thinking, well, what do I love about this work that I'm doing now? What really drives me? And I think, I mean, first and foremost, I think what we're doing is really worthwhile. I mean, we're really not only supplying vaccines, but all of that, as I said, the supporting stuff that's needed to be able to get those vaccines to users. And so I think, you know, it's very timely and very critical, and particularly amongst the Pacific countries that obviously rely very heavily on Australian aid. It's a very dynamic space to be working in. It literally changes every day. And so that's a real challenge as a MEL person, because you might design something, you're trying to sort of constantly keep up with how design is evolving, and you're trying to keep up your MEL to go with the design. And you have to be really flexible and adapt and be able to throw something out and repurpose it or redefine it quite often. So you can imagine, I mean, that's challenging personally. And as Ellie said, you have to draw on a whole range of skills and experience and knowledge about evaluation approaches and methods. But obviously it can be really frustrating. You can spend ages working on something and then you throw it out and have to reconfigure or redefine it. We're working across a lot of different countries and in different working contexts, and trying to get up to speed really quickly on them is really, really interesting. And the team at the centre, it's a really multidisciplinary team. So there are scientists, there are statisticians, there are project managers, people from ag, people from defence. So it's a really eclectic group of people, but you learn so much from them, and they're a really committed bunch. So I really, really enjoy that work. I would say in terms of challenges in working in this role, I've already talked about the fact that parameters are changing constantly, and that's a real challenge to keep up with those. Also, I guess working in a big government department, you know, there's lots of approval processes, as you can definitely imagine. But it's sort of interesting too, because this is something that's new for DFAT. They haven't done it before. It's new for everybody. It's very dynamic. And I think a lot of DFAT has, you know, traditionally been set up for very sort of more traditional aid programming. So it's trying to match what you need to do with the systems and processes that exist within DFAT, and sometimes having to create your own new ones because they don't exist for what you need to do. So that can be challenging and take time. So you're trying to create the processes to be able to roll out what you're doing in terms of programming at the same time. But a really, you know, interesting space to do, and I love it. Just very briefly, just to touch on where I came from to get to this position. So I was a bit like Ellie. She said she didn't have a linear pathway, career pathway. And I always talk about shuffling sideways in my career many times over, because that's what I feel like I've done. So I started with a journalism background, actually, and got into MSF working as their regional public information officer for the former Soviet Union countries. There were 11 countries in the former Soviet Union and Mongolia. And the only reason, well, the reason I got that role was because I had this quirky combination of communications background and I spoke Russian. And so I ended up in that role. Then slowly moved into Mel and started working with people who had more skills and experience than me, like Ellie was mentioning, and really I really didn't know what I was doing initially at all, but I guess it was just working with people that did and trying to just being like a sponge and taking everything that they could possibly, provide to me. I've worked in the private sector, I've worked domestically, managing evaluation teams. I've worked on sort of longer term M&E roles like the current one, as well as short-term evaluations for Gates Foundation and various other people in different parts of the world. So I was just trying to quickly reflect on what's sort of helped me. I did a master's in international public health several years ago, and I think the skills-based courses, so the EPI, the biostats, much as they were a little bit painful for me because I research skills, all those sorts of ones, I found really, really useful. I keep drawing on them. I've drew on them a lot. I think applying for things a little bit beyond my experience. So not just going for things that were very safe, but applying for them and then trying to work out how I was going to do them once I got there, as best I could, or asking people when I didn't. And like developing over time just good knowledge and experience of different evaluation methods and approaches, because often when you're confronted with an evaluation, you're given a blank slate and you're sort of some questions, and you have to sort of draw on your whole toolbox of approaches and methods to try and work out how am I going to assess this or identify lessons learned or look for improvements or whatever. So slowly building those up. So even going for evaluations in using methodologies that you haven't used before is sometimes better than just always sticking to ones where you've used the methodology, you know what you're doing. So obviously you can build up expertise in that too, but going outside your comfort zone in that sense is a good thing as well. In terms of the hurdles, like some of the main hurdles I have had, I think early on, because I've worked a lot as a freelance consultant, and early on I used to get really frustrated because I'd go for lots of tenders. I didn't get a lot of tenders. I'd spend so much time applying for them. But I think over time, obviously you build experience, but you learn to go for ones that more closely match your skill set. Don't go for ones that are really outlandishly, that they're often, they want you to do 1,000 things, but their budget is minuscule and the time is minuscule, so you don't worry about going for those. I think just working with people and gaining experience, I think that really, really helped. I don't know how I'm going for time. Jill, should I was just going to really just quickly say that I just recently finished my PhD, which is why I looked a bit startled when Jill said doctor, because I'm still not used to that.
I'm just reading it on my list.
Oh, I know. But, so
I'm sure you're not far short of it. It'll be fine.
Oh no, I've got it now. I'm just not used to it. But I would say, did I need it for where I've got to now? No. Did it open up a whole new area of expertise for me? Yes. So the PhD was in culturally responsive evaluation, which is about questioning the status quo of the way that evaluation methods are often derived from Western or Western European thinking. And it's looking at other ways of thinking and knowing and how to apply those in evaluation. So having studied that for years, I've built up a certain level of expertise, and it's an area that I'd love to move into alongside this health security work and hopefully somehow marry the two at some point. So I've started, I want to continue doing research in that area. I've got all these plans. So just in terms of doing a PhD, if you did want to develop a specific area of expertise in evaluation and really open your mind in terms of ways of thinking and knowing, my mind exploded in terms of the types of, I don't know if my internet's okay, types of knowledge that I was able to garner. So I really encourage it. And it's a really good confidence thing as well, in terms of knowing, setting out to do something and then actually getting to the end of it and actually achieving it in terms of discipline and confidence. It's actually quite a good thing as well. I might leave it there, but thanks for listening.
No, thank you for that, Catherine. That was really good. I was going to ask one or two just point things, but we're getting quite a few queries in the chat box here, and a couple directed to you, Catherine. So I might address those first for you before we move on to Claire. So Bosibori's asking, when designing the frameworks of measures to capture performance, do you partner with locals in the Indo-Pacific, like at the design stage?
Yeah, so this is where my culturally responsive hat and my health security DFAT hat sometimes merge and sometimes don't. So ideally, what we would do is we would partner with local people to develop those MEL frameworks. But often what I'm doing is I'm doing one step removed. So for example, I've been working on different country level MEL frameworks the last few weeks. And so I would get several MEL frameworks from a country level and sort of aggregate them up to a country level. So those MEL frameworks, they would be working with people on the ground to put those together. So there might be a UNICEF framework, and there might be a WHO framework, and might be a World Bank framework, and then I'm taking them up to the next level. So at the moment, some of my work is one step removed, but ideally that's definitely what you would do, is you work alongside local counterparts and you'd ask them what they value and what's important for them to get out of the evaluation, not just what's important for the funder.
Yeah, okay, all right. And Kezia has asked, could you speak to the adaptive and flexible MEL programs that you've implemented when combined with remote and locally led teams? So sort of similar, I suppose.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we've had to sort of take an adaptive management approach to MEL, and that's something that's not regularly done in DFAT. So it's changing. Based on where the project is, or based on what the project is? Yeah, so this is for the vaccine access and health security initiative. Because it's moving so fast, you can't just evaluate it once every 6 months and then apply the learnings. Things have moved on 10 steps from there. So you have to be constantly getting data in a really quick rotation, feeding it back into program and modifying programming. So that's been, we've had to do a whole lot of organisational sort of education around what adaptive management is and how it's done, and set up the processes for that. The second part of the question, when combined with the remote and locally led teams, so I guess we are relying very heavily, as we would have anyway, on teams in each country to be collecting a lot of the primary data. And then we're using that data to adjust programming at an investment level, at a country level, and at a project level. So that's the short answer to that question.
I can think of follow-up ones, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll move on to Claire. Thank you for that, Catherine. That's really good. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Catherine, your turn. Oh, sorry, Claire. Catherine, thank you, Claire. Moving on to Claire now. So everyone, we've now got Claire Hansen. So Claire works in social inclusion. She's a social inclusion expert and has worked with a background in disability, gender, youth and protection. So she's mainly working, she has been working in Cambodia up until recently for about 3 years, but is now working in inclusion consultancy and has worked, as I said, in gender, equity, diversity and social inclusion as a programs manager. Claire, you might like to take it from there and give us a bit more information about what it is you've been doing and where that involves M&E.
Sure, no problem. First off, I would like to acknowledge that I am talking to you from the Moina land, and I would like to acknowledge Tasmania's Indigenous people, past, present and future. I can't think of a proper way to explain how I got to where I am, because the concept of a path is fairly abstract. It's been a bit of a tumultuous trek. I ended up in inclusion most likely because in my early 20s, I had a job set up in a university in Damascus, and it was all going brilliantly. I came home to say hello to my mother, and in that time, the Syrian war occurred. And in that particular moment, I went from being more or less a hippie to realizing the world is quite complex and we need to do something about it. And from there, I bounced around the world, just kind of working out what it was I wanted to do, but more where I could actually be effective, as opposed to just jumping in and saying, I can help, working out exactly what my skill set was and where I could be most useful. Given that it was this crisis that really kind of catapulted me into the development/humanitarian sectors, I was always most interested in forced migration. And within that, I've quickly discovered where I found the most interest and where I could be the most important to project work, etc., was by identifying people who were marginalized from these projects and ensuring that they were included. So did a Masters of Development Studies at Sydney University, focusing particularly on the integration of Syrian refugees into Jordan, and then somehow ended up in Cambodia because you need to get a foot in the door somehow. And quite similar to Ellie, I did a ANCP funded placement with Goodretan, which is an Australian organisation based in the Asia Pacific region. And I was their very first social inclusion person. So to explain kind of what social inclusion is, in and of itself is quite complicated. You'll hear a lot of different definitions. It's becoming very, very, very popular in the development sector. DFAT has recently set up its own social inclusion, disability, gender, Indigenous group that they're still trying to work out exactly what that department does. But in a nutshell, it's ensuring that everybody, regardless of their identity, is included in project work. And my particular thing that I'm just forever trying to drive home to people is that identity isn't singular. If you're talking about a project to include women, it's not just women. It's women who might be Indigenous, might have a disability, or probably a mother, a community leader, etc. There are a variety of identities that each individual person holds, and you have to understand them before you can program effectively. And that's how I ended up within anything to do with monitoring and evaluation. Because in my master's degree, when I looked at the M&E courses, I was just terrified. It was all quantitative, and I am not a numbers person. I went to the first lecture, and I left halfway through. I was like, no. I don't understand statistics. I don't understand any of these equations. I'm out. And I really wish I hadn't done that, because it took me a long time outside of my master's to actually get those skill sets back up again. But the thing that I've ended up doing, mostly through my work in Cambodia, is really driving home who is involved in a project, who's there and what their needs are. And that's where monitoring and evaluation becomes becomes so necessary and so apparent. And within that, there's the duality of what's important to donors, as is the ever-present reality of the development sector, and what's important to an organization or a project itself. So trying to think of kind of the best way to talk about it without getting really complex. And I'll give the example of the organization I've been working with most recently. So it's a small social enterprise called Agile Development Group, which focuses specifically on women with disabilities who have entrepreneurial mindsets or just need to work, basically. We pivoted to focus specifically on women with disabilities a few years ago because we identified that there was a gap in programming. Cambodia, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is incredibly saturated by NGOs. There's one in every corner, there's one in every province and town. They're always overlapping, they often have competitive ideals, and yet somehow between all of these bits and pieces, women with disabilities are being completely left out. So Agile Development Group was born. And when the COVID crisis hit and I got locked out, which wasn't particularly sad for me, I jumped on board with the Agile Development Group. One of the first meetings we had was to work out how our funding was going, because with COVID, no one knew what was happening. DFAT was pulling money out, USAID was pulling money out. We also got money from Japan and EU, and everyone was moving money around everywhere. No one knew what was going on. And this is where it became very apparent that the M&E frameworks that had been put in place by donors were far too complex and far too abstract to be understood by the organization I was working with. Despite the fact they're incredibly intelligent, they just didn't have time to understand everyone's different competing concepts. So we sat down with a group of other organizations who had similar funders. So in this one, it was DFAT and then USAID from USA, obviously, and also JICA, which is the Japanese aid, who are the primary funders in that region. And we just sat down, worked out what they all had in common, worked out the data that had to be collected to satisfy those groups, and trained up the organizations to do that. And that was very much qualitative, so very much counting of numbers, and not particularly complex if you understood a lot around M&E, but very hard to explain to someone who's working on the ground with women why we need to know how old they are, why we need to know where they're born, their marital status, all these different indicators that particularly USAID and DFAT were interested in. Incredibly hard to work out how to explain to people why anyone would care, which is when we moved into the kind of capacity building side of monitoring and evaluation that I spend a lot of my time doing. So that's sitting down with primarily CSOs, like civil society organizations, a lot of disability organizations or DPOs, and small enterprises to build their own monitoring, evaluation, and particularly learning framework, and really harness who they want to get to, so who their target audience is, working out need assessments based around that, or baseline studies, or any of these large tools, identifying indicators and targets. So just writing down who's there and what impact you're trying to have, and then what learning you can get out of this. So again, not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but really trying to drive home the concept of, if you are closely following what's happening in your projects and your trainings and your design, you have the ability to adapt and change and recognize the needs of your audience. So that's the part of monitoring evaluation that I personally find the most interesting and by far the most effective. And also how we can use that to kind of satisfy the requirements of the various different donors. I can talk about that for a very long time, so I'll stop. But the other thing that I found myself doing, and I'm constantly fascinated by, is evaluation of organizations as a whole and how that organization impacts its projects. So I'm a huge proponent of you can't design a conclusive program or project unless you are an inclusive organization yourself. So within this, I'll partner always with kind of country people, like people from the country that their people are targeting, etc., and just jump in and see how women are included in the organization, how people with disabilities are included in the organization, ages, different ethnic groups, different social economic status, etc., who's designing the projects, why they're there, and how that maps on to how the projects are actually run and monitored. And I find this is the most effective way to set up an effective monitoring and evaluation framework for an organization itself. It's finding out who's writing it and why they're writing it. So if the only reason you're writing it is to satisfy a donor requirement, it's not going to be a particularly effective system, because no one's going to care. They're not very interesting. They're interesting once you get to the meta level and you have all this data together, and then it's deeply fascinating to read. But on the ground, no one's really interested. But once you can integrate that back in with what the team's actually interested in and what you really want, the impact that people really want to have with their projects and with their trainings, etc., then you can start working out a framework by which people can adapt and learn as they go. Am I making any sense at all?
Sorry, I just realized I had my microphone off. Yeah, no, you are making sense. I'm just curious, so are you saying that you're better off going on the ground with the people you're working with, you're better off using that as a starting point to, aside from using maybe a basic template, but to use that to design your M&E program, because you're using the local knowledge rather than taking in a full-blown design pre-made.
Yeah, I do find it's the most effective. Having any kind of standardized framework is of course useful because you have something to speak to. But I find if you're going to try to create ownership over any kind of system, it's better to go from I guess you could say, a strength-based approach. So working out what people already understand and know and what's important, and integrating that into a framework. That's not to completely diss any kind of standardized evaluation models, because they are extremely useful and very intelligent people have created them. But it's about ensuring that they're adapted to context and can be utilized in that context. It's a difficult line to tread, what's useful for the organization and the project itself, and how you can then explain that out to other people outside, particularly donors, but also any other stakeholders. And the different communication strategies that you need to design based on the data that you've established from an organization is in itself complex. And I have an utmost respect for communications people, because that is really difficult work.
So you don't hear that very often, so it's nice. I'm in communication, so it's nice to hear that. It's very nice to hear that, especially in the development sector. So are you finding that stakeholders that you're working with, say for instance in Cambodia, or even your biggest stakeholders, be it DFAT or whoever, are happy for you to take in just a basic framework and construct it more in detail on the ground with your, like you say, both the input from the CSOs as well as your group, say Agile, in terms of putting in a program, and the stakeholders find that you're meeting their needs, or do they also put demands on what they expect that M&E to be?
A bit of both. I wouldn't say they're so much happy as tolerant of my approach. It's just in so much as the indicators, targets, etc., that have been given by larger stakeholders or donors are there and apparent, and I can pull out the data that is necessary for their reporting, then it's all okay. The other huge consideration, of course, is around any kind of policy that you've signed on to, whether it be child protection, women's empowerment, the rights of people with disabilities, etc. Just ensuring you're compliant with all those things is, of course, integral to designing all these things as well. And it gets, again, very complicated. And I tip my hat to compliance people because it's tricky. But yeah, it's ensuring that you can pull the data that's necessary for the larger reports out without overwhelming the system itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I'm just interested also, you were talking about the Agile Development Group and how it's focused on women with disabilities. Have you found that hard, being such a specific target group, as opposed to, and is often a group that needs supporting within developing countries, is people with disabilities in general, as opposed to just females with disabilities? So has it been hard to target just women with disabilities?
It has been. We do a lot of piggybacking of larger projects. So anytime anything's aimed at women's empowerment, we're like, but what about women with disabilities? Yeah. or anything around livelihood, etc. Increasingly, disability is mentioned and women are pinpointed specifically. There is an increasing recognition of intersectionality coming out of larger donors, which is great. And DFAT is very much leading the way on that and has for quite a while. But it's still, you still kind of have to knock on the door and be like, hi guys, hi, we're here, hi, can we get this done? But often people are very excited to have Agile Development Group on board because it is so specific, but also because you can have such a big impact and showcase it very well. That you're talking about stories of significant change previously. It's incredibly easy to get that when you're working with women entrepreneurs with disabilities, because they're already doing a hell of a lot of stuff that no one's talked about. So you kind of hit the ground running.
And is Agile focused only in Cambodia? Is it only a group in Cambodia, or is it within the region?
It's actually moving to be regional. We just started a thing called Mekong Inclusive Ventures, which is going to be more regional. Agile will remain specifically focused on women entrepreneurs with disabilities in Cambodia. But then under Mekong Inclusive Ventures, we've got a series of other ventures, and we were moving into Myanmar, but that's been put on hold for fairly obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But we've got and have done consulting work in Indonesia, Vietnam and Laos previously.
Wow, okay. Okay, well, that's really cool. All right, that's great. Thank you for that, Claire. That's really good. I'm just having a quick look in the chat box there, Chris, to see, I'm just seeing if I've not seen questions that have been asked for maybe Claire or some of the others. I think Catherine put up details of her thesis, which was great because people were asking about that. Thank you for that, Catherine. Which sort of courses, so I think this is for you, Claire, which sort of courses should I get? Oh, this might be for all of you. Should I get, if I'm not a numbers person, this relates to what you were saying, Claire, but I want to go into the M&E area. I'm not sure if you want to go into M&E, you can actually avoid numbers. I'm a bit with Claire. I hate quantitative. I prefer qualitative, but, you know, you have to accept numbers, I think. I'm not sure there is an area you can go into, Yasnina. Any thoughts from any of our three guests about that, in terms of if you're looking at M&E and you sort of want to avoid numbers to an extent, is there still a pathway into M&E, or do you have to accept that?
I just put in a chat that there's that master's course. I think it's the University of Melbourne. Maybe someone can confirm that. That's probably seems like the best one in Australia, or the one that seems most popular. And I'm sure that would have some quant elements to it. But as I said in my chat, I think you're right, Jill, in that you want to be able to look at numbers and at least be confident enough to be able to, you know, analyze them, or at least have an initial assessment of what they're telling you. Yeah. And also when you design MEL, you might design a MEL design that has both qual and quant elements to it. So you've got to know and understand enough about quant to be able to put that into a design and to work with quant people. So I would say, even if you hate numbers, and I don't think any of us really said we really like numbers. I mean, although I like them more than I used to, but I would recommend doing some quant and just grinning and bearing and doing it, because it really will help you be a sort of a well-rounded MEL person. Yeah,
and when you think about it, it is research and statistics and stuff in terms of monitoring and evaluation, so you're really not going to be able to avoid it to any great extent. Okay, do we have other questions for anybody? Sorry?
Jill, there were a couple of questions. Alina asked, Claire, could you tell us what your day-to-day involves in your role as a social inclusion expert?
It's very varied. Day-to-day, it tends to include assessment and capacity building is probably the best way to put it. A lot of the time, I'm working with counterparts, whether it be within Australia or within organisations, to assess what's happening at the time, where the inclusion gaps are, or where people want to be. And the other is just tailoring trainings. There's a lot of working out where the inclusion gaps are, and then designing a training specifically suited to filling that gap. The most common one I come across around disability, for example, is there's a huge lack of disability data in the world, and there's a set of questions called the Washington Short Set, which is one of the only recognized data sets around impairments. I spend a lot of my time training people on how to understand and use those questions. At the moment, a significant amount of my time, but it changes and shifts depending on what each organization needs.
And Natalie has asked, for someone who's in the early stages of their career in evaluation, do you think it's more important to have qualifications or subject matter expertise in development or in evaluation?
Anyone want to tackle that one?
Yeah, feel free.
I thought about this when I was preparing for the session, and I think it's probably helped me to have more subject matter expertise. But for example, if you do a Bachelor of Arts or a Master's in International Development or International Relations, all of those types of degrees give you skills in research, critical thinking and data analysis, which is very aligned to monitoring and evaluation in the field. Obviously, monitoring and evaluation is more applied, and there's a lot of different methods that you will probably learn, but to have that basic foundation is really valuable and probably enough. just to build on what Catherine was saying around quantitative skills, I think if you're very much not a numbers person and feel that statistics is too much to do a course in, it is sufficient to just, I suppose that the most important thing, I think, is the critical analysis or critical thinking. So once you get the results from a survey, looking at those numbers and saying, does this make sense? And if you triangulate it with qualitative evidence that you've also collected, what is this really saying? And are these numbers sort of representative of what we're thinking, or is it correct in terms of our assumptions, or are we assuming something that's not really reflective of what's there? So I would say in short, the foundations of just having research and that critical thinking, probably research methods, I know is across a lot of humanities degrees, but the Masters of Evaluation, which is at Melbourne Uni, you don't have to do the whole thing. You can opt to do 1 or 2 subjects, and there are subjects such as Introduction to Qualitative and Quantitative Methods. So if you want to combine that with say moving into the fields, that could also set you up really well.
Okay, thanks, Ellie. Just one for you, Claire, that I've noticed, which I think is quite an interesting one, again from Vasibori, is in terms of agile development, the agile development group, and looking at disability, have mental health issues been adapted as part of what you're looking at, included or even considered to be included as part of what you're incorporating?
Oh, how I very wish we could do more. Mental health as a concept in Cambodia is very new, and there's a lot of shame associated with it. So programming specifically for mental health is extremely difficult. One thing we've managed to do is a lot around what was essentially PTSD. And this is recognized again through the Washington short set, and people have difficulty remembering or concentrating, which is a common sign of PTSD, which is incredibly common in Cambodia for the obvious history of its complex war. And we do a lot of capacity building and training around adapting our training specifically for that purpose. Beyond that, we don't have the expertise, and I don't want to touch mental health programming without people really knowing what they're doing. But also I firmly believe it's better if people come from the context with that. And there's a huge capacity lack within Cambodia of people who have expertise in psychology or anything around this. So it becomes extremely difficult. It is changing. They've started a psychology degree at Phnom Penh University, which is the first in the country, and it's super exciting. But unfortunately, in the minute, it's a gigantic gap that hopefully will be filled.
Yeah, it's certainly a hard area to try and incorporate in everything. It's such an expansive area on its own. Just quickly before we try and get to a quick breakout room section, which is what we wanted to do at this point, I just wanted to ask about, somebody asked a question and I've lost it now, a question about the pandemic. Sorry, so Regina asked, and this can be to all 3 of you or anyone who wants to answer, is that how have you felt the pandemic? And obviously this is possibly also Catherine's key focused area, but how has it impacted on M&E practice, and what are the key challenges that you've encountered maybe in terms of either working remotely or trying to deal with? And I think Catherine, you said there are several, was it you, Catherine, or one of the others said about people like big donors and that pulling out, or different things happening around the pandemic and what was because of what was happening?
One thing that has happened a lot, as I think the question refers to, is there's a lot more emphasis on remote monitoring. To my mind, that's something that should have been happening anyway, because it's about empowering people in the country to have the capacity and the skills and the knowledge to collect the data, to analyse the data, and setting up systems for that to happen. So it's interesting because a lot of, say, institutions here have had to move to an increasingly remote sort of MEL monitoring approach in the last 1 to 1.5 years. And, so that in a way while it's been difficult sometimes to get data and you've had to sort of adapt the data expectations that you've had, at the same time, there's been a whole lot of a shift in empowerment and a shift in sort of localized capacity, which has actually been a real positive.
Okay. Anyone else, Ellie or Claire, to that one in terms of M&E being impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, I agree with Catherine's point. I think it's really shifted the focus to hiring more national staff. In the role I'm working in remotely for the UN Women's Spotlight team, there's a lot more national staff on the ground, and I'm working directly with them, but they are doing the primary data collection, and that could in terms of the power imbalance, I think it would have been very different in country and or harder to make sure that they're leading the work. So I'm really encouraged by that. I was in a remote interview the other day, and the majority of the participants were Timorese, and they were leading the interview because I wasn't there, and also it was in Teton. So I also was very glad that they were leading it. But yeah, it made me really, really pleased that this is like it. Yeah, it needs to be that way. So COVID has helped that. One challenge, I think, with lockdowns, we found data sometimes just can't be collected. So we have to find other ways of collecting data. We've been doing interviews on WhatsApp, but again, internet is varied. So in terms of data collection quality and the progress and ability to collect it in a fast-paced environment is very challenging. So that means that the work takes longer, or there's not enough to inform, say, a training that we want to design. So that's a challenge.
Okay, thank you for that, Ellie. Chris, did you want to try and organise our breakout rooms at this point? Because we've got questions coming in, but we'll need to draw the line somewhere, and we might, if we get time, have a bit of a discussion afterwards, but we'll go to breakout rooms at this point. I think, Chris, do you want to manage that?
Okay, so you'll be joining, there are 5 rooms. Jill, Layla, Amelia, Michelle and myself will lead a room. We'll just be there for about 10-15 minutes. Who you are, what your role is and what organisation you're at, and then what the key thing is you learned from today. And if there's time, drop in some topics you'd like to see us run next year in the chat box. So you'll get a 1-minute warning to come back. Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, with the Australian Sports Partnerships Program, Team Up.
Yes, yeah, I've heard of it. Oh, fantastic.
GHD, yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to hop back out. I'm just organising the rooms. Okay. Hi, everyone. How are you?
Hi there. How's it going?
People coming in. Hi, it's going well. I'm just doing a little bit of checking. It looks like we've got some people who are, yep, no, we are just opening all the rooms. So do carry on. Phoebe, do you think you can lead our discussion today? And Phoebe, you're on mute. Darn. Phoebe, can you hear me?
International Relations at UQ. I did, and then by the
And so, yes, I moved to Canberra from Melbourne. I'm a
like to go down.
Oh, sorry about that. Rita and Molly, Rita, we didn't see you in the room. Sorry if you missed out on that.
come on, baby. No.
We're back.
Hey, yep, we're streaming in.
We're streaming
at the
in.
moment. Yep.
I was going to say I was going to pop. Oh gosh. Yep. Everyone's back.
Yep. Everyone's here.
They're all popping in.
Indeed. Okay. So, do you, Jilly, you happy if I do this bit?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yep, you want to take the comments back?
Yep.
All right. So I popped into one room and heard some interesting comments, particularly about one. Regina really enjoyed the ethical side of the discussion. So I'm going to just ask the breakout leaders to give us one comment that came out of their room that they thought was particularly interesting. So I'll go to Jill first.
Sorry, I'll pop my microphone back on. We time always goes so fast, but I think one of the common threads that came out was that the development sector, firstly, the development sector is very much runs a lot when you're trying to get into it or when you're working within development sector, runs very much on a lot of volunteer work as well as trying to get paid jobs, but works a lot on volunteering, no matter who you're volunteering for, a big NGO or a small one. Another recommendation for those who have been to our events before, Barty from who's here with us, she's out walking her dog at the moment. She was one of our guest speakers at one of our last events and recommended a book called Data Feminism, which is on data collection. So a few people might know that one. And Barty, I don't know if you can still hear us or anything, but I think that's right. It's called Data Feminism. She highly recommended it for people who are interested, obviously, around M&E, if you're trying to get your head around data collection and numbers and stuff, that was a really good one. But also the fact that from what she was saying was that on the ground, when you're in locations, you have to be very flexible about the scope of where you're starting your data collection from, at what point you're starting it from, because everyone has a different starting point. And she was using her example of they're running a program in PNG on digital literacy and where people's capacity for that starts from, and therefore where you do your measurements from, varies greatly because the starting point for everyone is so different. Right. So that were just a couple of things that came out of our discussion.
Thank you. Michelle, how about your room?
I did not take a lot of notes because I was busy collecting everyone's LinkedIn details out of the chat box, but people can perhaps jump in if I forget anything. We talked a little bit about how interesting it must be to be doing evaluation, particularly from within a large organisation, but at a time of pandemic where so much is up in the air, and even as monitoring and evaluation tools are always tailored to a context, at this particular moment they're being tailored to a context that no one's actually ever done monitoring and evaluation in before. I think Alyssa made another really good point that I've forgotten, so if she can jump in and say that, that would be great, and Bossy as well.
Okay, thank you. Now we only wanted one comment. I'm going to get them to put their comments in the chat box because we're going to run out of time otherwise. Layla, how about your room?
Oh, we had an awesome discussion actually. Briefly, we looked at challenging the notion of using Western ways of collecting M&E and looking at Indigenous and cultural ways, and also challenging the notions of doing, of knowing. And one example was, I'm not sure if I'll pronounce it correctly, storytelling in Fijian, or it's known across the Pacific, is it Talanoa? Yeah, and I think also Saran provided another great idea when I put the question of, how do we deal with quantitative data and, the notions of critical thinking and research and all this. And luckily with having more than one way of there's more than quantitative data, there's qualitative, and using participatory approach, the most significant change. I think that also came through in the main session about how it's easier to get very rich insight and much easier to share and build people's capacity on that method.
Thank you. That's great. Amelia, did you have you got one comment for us too from your group?
Definitely. So we kind of used our time with Ellie, kind of the Q&A session, just to kind of talk about what we discussed. We talked about M&A courses and choosing a bit on going into that expertise, and a lot of our participants were in the earlier stages of their career. And I think Ellie's popped in the chat some great recommendations for online short courses with edX, and I think Coursera it was, about building those technical skills that you may not be able to get throughout your degree or want to delve into a bit more. And also talking about the different ways of moving from government into development and different work. And yeah, so it was really great just to have Ellie to bounce off. So thank you, Ellie, if I've missed anything, but I hope that was everything that we discussed.
Thank you. That's fabulous. And as Michelle mentioned, we want to collect your LinkedIn links. If you'd like to pop those in the chat box, we will compile those later and circulate them so you can link up with people. We're here for networking. And if you've got ideas and questions still, please put them in, because we will do a blog after this and you'll be able to go in and get some more of those answers. So for the last 3 minutes, fast typing, as I say a very big thank you to Ellie, Catherine and Claire for being here tonight. We really appreciate your sharing of your knowledge, and your experience is fantastic. You will be receiving from us our wonderful and marvellous Women in Aid and Development mug, which is an absolutely beautiful addition to anyone's desk. And of course, it adds a little promotion to the people around you. But we really appreciate it. I also want to say thank you to our breakout room leaders. Thanks for doing that. Our next event is going to be on volunteering and e-volunteering. It's a big issue, but it's a bit of a lighter one because we want to get lots of people's input in our last event of the year. We expect that we'll be online, but we hope that we might be able to make it face-to-face in 1 or 2 spots. Fingers crossed. 2022, we are really hoping that we're going to be back and together in face-to-face, having a drink, having a nibble, and really doing some fantastic networking. So our next event, Tuesday, 23 of November is our tentative date. Keep an eye on the emails. And I just want to say we have our mentoring program running, and if you're a member, then you are able to access that. We're looking at some more workshops that'll be run end of the year and next year. We have some really interesting new ideas coming through for those workshops, and we do encourage you, come along, be a member. It costs $50 a year, and for that you get access to a couple of face-to-face events, all of our online events, and we love seeing you. And of course, the key with this is networking. We know that men have been doing it for years. We are doing it for women now, because the women that you make contact with, they might have a job that you can apply for, or they'll certainly have information that you can garner. So thank you again for coming. Fabulous roll up this evening. And again, really appreciate your time, Ellie, Claire and Catherine. And a big thank you to Jill, who is a consummate MC. Really appreciate you taking us through. Thanks to everyone.
Sure.
Don't run away until you've put your LinkedIn link in that chat box. There is a recording and we will be popping that so that you can get access to that afterwards if you'd like to. And last, if you pop in your thought in there or your question, we'll aim to get that back out to you on our blog. So thanks everyone for coming, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Everyone, bye. Take care.
Bye. Thanks a million.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks, Michelle.
Everyone.
Bye.
And thanks, Jill. So much appreciated.
Absolute pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Oh, great. It's always a fascinating conversation, isn't it?
It is.
And lots to...
We could go for hours, honestly. And I was very impressed with how much we had going on in the chat box, which was great. People asking lots of questions. It was good.
Yeah. Hard to keep up sometimes.
Yeah.
Which is great. And if we weren't all completely sick to death of Zooms, we might actually stay here for a bit longer.
I know. There is that issue with it, but you know, we'll get around. Let's see, like you say, the next one might be face to face. You never know.
Indeed, and if we can do that, then we do at least have another couple of hours.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. You can have longer conversations, and people can do their networking face to face, sort of thing, you know, individually. So that's good too. All right, Dale, have a really good night, and thank you for doing that.
Thanks a million.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.